yeah, mute yourself. Oh, perfect. Thank you, Sophie. And mute yourself when someone is presenting, and use the hand or put questions in the chat to ask questions. And most importantly, yeah, to have fun and learning together and making useful things from this workshop that we can all use in our work. Just gonna go quickly over the agenda. So over the next hour, we've curated a wonderful panel discussion with some great speakers who will speak for 6 minutes each, and they will share their expertise and experience and knowledge of working with communities and doing research with communities. And then we will open to a Q&A, which Catherine will moderate. So do put your questions in the chat. And after the presentation, we will split into small groups for an hour. And we will have 2 rounds of small groups. There will be 5 rooms in each round, and each room will discuss one of the 5 main topics. The themes, so in these rooms, we'll be discussing how to include marginalized and underrepresented communities in the research. We'll talk about the best practice methods across several fields and the challenges of including all voices in research, and how can we overcome these challenges. And also, how can we make these processes and conversations more inclusive, but also alongside this, what are the great advantages of ensuring that we hear everybody. Before I give the floor to our speakers, I'm gonna pass on to Catherine to talk, to give a quick overview of the aim of this session and why we are talking about community-led research. So yeah, over to you, Catherine.
Hi everyone, it's brilliant to have you all here. So you might be wondering, why did we put on this session? So one of the main reasons we're here is because we're really curious about understanding how we can shift power to enable truly community-led research. And kind of one of the reasons why we've been thinking about this as a challenge is because last summer, Newham Council, who I work for, Compost CIC, who's here represented by Alexis and Caroline, and a UCL, who's represented by Saffron, and I think Juliet might be here as well. We submitted a funding bid to explore how a community research network could work for and with more marginalised communities in Newham. You know, we realise that not enough is being done to work with more marginalised groups in research and policy making, who've been historically marginalised, and that could be through historical and institutional racism, prevailing feelings around ableism, and just kind of more entrenched inequality. So over the next few months, what we're trying to do is explore how could a community research network work in Newham. And the key kind of principles we're aiming for is that we really want to build equitable partnerships. So by that, we mean kind of overcoming historical inequalities to create something which is truly equal. We want like really meaningful collaboration, and crucially, we want this to have mutual benefit and learning to everyone who's involved. And some of the key questions we're asking, which is kind of reflected in the themes today, you know, we're asking ourselves, you know, how do we learn from what's already going on? You know, how can we share what we learn, and how can we, and what others are learning as well? You know, and how can we make those partnerships really equitable, working with local community groups in Newham who support marginalised people kind of on, you know, on the front line. And ultimately, what do we need to do differently as a local council, as academic institutions, to really make community research inclusive, but also to make it have real impact and to be allies in that impact, so that, you know, research changes and we actually create real tangible change. So, and then just generally that question around like, how do we shift power in what can be more kind of traditionally done research to create that change? So these are just some of the questions we're kind of asking ourselves over the next few months. And kind of the reason we brought you here is that we realize, you know, we're not the only ones doing this kind of work. We don't have all the answers. And these are the types of questions that we think that a lot of people are probably grappling with. And we really wanted to create a space and a forum to discuss some of these issues. And hopefully that will have a benefit for everyone involved. So without much further ado, I'm going to pass over back to Diala. And I think we've got our first speaker.
Right. Thank you so much, Catherine. Yeah, I'm going to let the speakers introduce themselves. To start off, our first speaker is Juliet. And Juliet, you've got 6 minutes now, and I'll give you a 2-minute warning.
Fantastic. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. And it's really a pleasure to share our experience with you. So I'm coming from a sort of a grassroots perspective to answer this question. So first of all, I'm Juliet Ken. I'm one of the directors of Star Trust, and we work with marginalized and unseen and under-resourced communities to bring about social justice. And I'm personally someone who lived in Newham, grew up in Newham as a refugee. And so my perspective to this discussion is really bringing the lived experience to you, and also the work we've done with marginalized communities. So if I go to slide 2. So as part of our work over the last 15 years, Star Trust with its partners has worked with some of the communities you see here on the screen. We've worked with undocumented migrants, victims of human trafficking, refugees, people with no recourse to public funds, and other communities that are normally unseen. And there's certainly lots of intersectionality between these communities. And one thing that's come across very clearly, and I've experienced this myself, is that there's lots of situations where these communities have to evidence and prove and justify why they have to and can stay in this country. And that's sometimes on a daily basis with their interactions with institutions, interactions with service providers, interactions with local authorities, and that can be draining and that can be demoralizing. And it brings about different emotions and experiences with each community. I mean, I was actually thinking back over the last I'm 43 now, so the first sort of between the age of 18 and 30, I personally took part in at least 60 different research situations with various individuals who wanted to understand my experience of homelessness and being a refugee. And those were in situations where you feel like you want to contribute towards social change, but also it's taxing emotionally and resource-wise. So these communities in general are communities that are trying to find a way to stay in this country and to make a life here, but there's an intersection between them wanting to give of themselves, because that is what they need to kind of get the resources they need to survive, and also the power dynamic. So if we go to slide 2. So these are some of the different institutions and authorities and organizations that we've interacted with over the years, all wanting to do the right thing, I would say, and the communities that we serve also wanting to be part of that conversation. And I would say that on an average week, we probably get 3 or 4 requests for research opportunities, and it's exciting. But with that comes a certain dynamic that's been prevalent over the last few decades. Slide 3. So some of the things that we've experienced over the last years is that usually the dynamic is that the methodologies and the questions when it comes to research are predefined. So by that we mean there's a date set, and the communities sort of have to sort of fit within that framework. The structures and processes are normally already predefined. There are very rarely opportunities to sort of build rapport and relationship beforehand. And it can be quite extractive in the sense of, again, the community is experiencing another situation where they have to, the only way to have a conversation is to answer questions about their personal and experiences, which can be very vulnerable, as giving of themselves, and can be also traumatic or re-traumatizing. There's a question about resourcing, at least from Star Trust's perspective and our partners that we've worked with across Newham. That also costs time. It needs a giving of space. It needs for us to work with those communities to explain why this is important and to get them on board. And usually there's very little resources beforehand to do that work. As we probably all here in the room will probably hopefully understand that there are power dynamics that play out within those situations.
Sorry, Juliet, you've got 2 minutes left.
2 minutes left. And sometimes there's also lack of cultural awareness within those conversations when it comes to understanding some of the things that those communities might find very sensitive, for example. Even something as simple as, what is your certain communities can have different names that they will call themselves, and because of their interactions with institutions, they might feel quite vulnerable in terms of stating, who they are and where they come from. Next slide, please. So when it comes to sort of the tips that I would give in terms of for us to get to a point where we can shift power when it comes to research, and one of the best experiences we had, if I can share that, was with an organization, I hope I can name them. They were called Community Development Fund, and this is many years ago, where they actually gave us a fund of £10,000 3 months before the research project to say, can you do some work with the communities that we want to engage with, and we will fit within your framework. And with that, we basically asked the community that we're working with, these were trafficked young people, how they would like to interact with this research. And they decided they wanted to tell their story in a creative form. So we matched each young person with an artist for a period of 3 months to work together to sort of co-create and tell their story. And the researchers sat along that process. And that was a way in which they were able to extract their research in a positive way, but fit alongside the young people's co-design. And the young people and the artists created an art piece and an exhibition of their story, which was called Unexpected Journeys. And it won Time Out Exhibition of the Month. And in terms of the tips, some of the things I would say, a clear purpose and joint ownership of the project is really important. Co-design is really vital. Creating safe environments, that means kind of building trust and having relational dialogue. So if you are part of a research project, giving of yourself as a researcher as well, as a human being, and empathy within that, so that it feels like you are building rapport. And flexibility is vital. Different people have different times where they feel most comfortable, and really reflecting on how can you make the end product more as accessible as possible. There is a feeling within local communities that research done and then the information goes off somewhere and never comes back to them. So if that can be changed, that will be fantastic. And certainly, how do we shift power dynamics? That's a conversation we can have later in our rooms. So I hope I've given you a little bit of a taster. I mean, it's only 6 minutes, and I'm happy to answer any question. But yeah, I look forward to meeting you in the various rooms later to continue the conversation. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Juliet. And do ask Juliet any questions in the chat. She will be in the working with communities to do research breakout room. So there's kind of like an initial few minutes to ask Juliet any questions about that, to give you inspiration for the questions that we'll cover in that area. Our second speaker in this theme is Alexis, and I'm going to hand over to Alexis to introduce herself and her work around that theme. Over to you, Alexis. You've got 6 minutes, and I'll give you 2 minutes warning. I can't hear Alexis. Alexis, maybe you're on mute.
Okay, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Hi everybody, thank you for coming. My name's Alexis and I'm the Community Engagement Manager for the Newham Community Research Network, and also part of Compost SIC as well. So just a quick introduction about me. So my parents actually came from the Caribbean, the island, and as you can see in the picture there, lovely, beautiful island, and came across from there to the UK through the Windrush. So I'm actually, I was born in the UK, but I'm a child of migrants and understand the entrepreneurship and the situations that parents or people may often find themselves into. I've done a lot of work in Stratford, Newham, and I'm based in Newham. I studied in Newham, as well as other large institutions. And my values are championing community-led research and inclusivity in East London. The next slide, please. Thanks. So what have I done before? So I've been working with the Institute of Global Prosperity and UCL for some time now, in various capacities, first as a citizen scientist myself, and also as a project leader for citizen scientist work. So where have I done this work? I've done this work in a number of growth boroughs, as you can see, East London, Carpenter's Estate, East London, Stratford, Chobham Manor, Hackney, Hackney Wick, Tower Hamlets, Fish Island, Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. I've also been involved in taking a number of policymakers from Hackney, Newham, and growth boroughs around the Olympic Park and in East London on tours, so they can have a look at some of the issues which have presented themselves from marginalised groups. So here, as you can see here, we've got the Mayor of Hackney on the left-hand side, and we're sort of having a little bit of an ethnographic walk around to some of the key estates in both Hackney, Wick and Stratford. Next slide, please. So what have we done? So we've used a number of tools and models for our community research work, and we've worked in teams. So I've given you an example here of one of the key tools that we use. So a walk-in ethnography is basically someone who is potentially walking along and observing the environment and feeling the experience around them. So they look at the sort of the sky, they look at the smell, they look at what's going on. And this tool is called A4x4. And basically this tool is about looking at certain parts of your experience. So the actors being people that are in the environment that you're looking at, the artifacts or objects that you see that relate to that area. So for example, in the picture on the right-hand side, top right, you can see there are some artist paintings, some trash toys, etc. We also use what activities can we see that's happening around us? Are people walking, playing, sitting down? What's the atmosphere like? Is it bright? Is it sunny? Is it rainy? What is it like? So these are some of the sort of tools and observations that we take as we are approaching this community-led research. Another set of tools that I've used as a sort of a team leader for projects and project research is Kolb's experiential learning cycle, as well as Gibbs' reflective cycle. So what these models really do is they get you to reflect on how the team operates and to get feedback from the team. And in our case, to make it in a very practical level, what we did is we had drop-in sessions with our team members who were citizen scientists from the community of Newham. And they would, you know, tell us their problems, and we would reflect on those, and we would be able to help everybody with that. So moving on to the next slide. As part of my research, I've looked at what are the barriers to prosperity. And as you can see, through all these different growth boroughs, we've sort of found that some of the key analysis is the inequalities in different areas. So there are some sectors of Newham and Hackney, which are both very wealthy versus obviously very poor areas, as you can see on the left-hand side, top right, Carpenter's Estate. There's a lot of very much a big demand for food banks and donating food in both Hackney and Stratford. And I think one of my key articles, Repackaging Poverty, talks about these aspects, about the creativity and creative people needing space, and all of this in an area which is definitely over £9 billion has been invested in East London in terms of after the Olympics. And, you know, there are still some there are some high inequalities around. Most of our target groups have been refugees, Black and ethnic minority women. We've worked in networks with creative artists, entrepreneurs. I've spoken to a lot of white Irish who are based in Hackney, who are also considered to be marginalised, and working class East Enders. So this is now a bit about the networks that I've done. So my background is sort of really a key network driver. So I love networking, and my attitude has always been that networks are critical for marginalized groups. So I've set up quite a few networks for entrepreneurs and creative people in East London. And I've been involved in a lot of creative work in terms of creative diversity in tech, diversity in innovation, inclusive innovation. I've been involved in looking at inclusive spaces for women and children in East London. Obviously networks relating to research and citizen scientists, as well as the community. And that's just a little bit of it. Okay, amazing. So the next slide, thank you.
That's 6 minutes.
Okay, and this is the end now. So these are the key top tips that I would say if you want to build a successful network in East London. The critical things that has been fed back to me from our research is it needs to be sustainable. There is some need to have some sort of level of funding in terms of financial opportunity. Social capital is critical. Marginalized people, they need networks. They need to be able to interact with people who know people. These networks need to trust each other. They need to trust people so they can let you in, let people in, have discussion. Communication is critical. Resources, space, capacity building, and impact is really critical. I think that's the end of it. And then there's the last slide with just my name on it.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, Alexis. Yeah, that's 6 minutes. Yeah, thank you, Alexis. So yeah, do ask Alexis any questions in the chat. She'll be in the same breakout room with Juliet. And we're now gonna move to the second theme. We've got Sophie and Marcus discussing their projects around that, around the making equal research partnerships with communities. And they'll be facilitating the breakout rooms on that theme. First is Sophie. Sophie, you've got 6 minutes now, and I'll give you a 2-minute warning.
Thanks, Giala. I'm just going to do a big, deep breath and then just get it all done in 6 minutes. So lovely to see everyone here. My name is Sophie Everton. I'm the co-production service officer at Newham Council, and I supported the work of the domestic abuse strategy and the survivors' input into that strategy. So we used a trauma-informed co-production model for survivors of all forms of domestic abuse. It was important for us to consider the experience of survivors by ensuring that our approach and behaviour does not duplicate systems of power and control which they have previously experienced. So instead of thinking of research as the researcher and the subject, we're all working together to find solutions. So our model included the following. So our approach, it was important for us to be transparent. So that was within our communication with them, talking about our approach, being clear about our engagement with them, and being values led. So that's respectful, sensitive, and appreciating their participation. So we needed to be open and recognize the power imbalance and privilege in our roles. So we tried to not have an us and them attitude. It meant using normal, accessible language, creating a friendly and informal environment, and being accountable to the commitments and promises that we make. So we also important to give survivors and residents the space, time, and opportunity to participate meaningfully. So that means enabling them to take the lead and make decisions on how they wish to engage rather than us deciding for them. So whether that's having a one-to-one, group discussions, virtual, in person, people just prefer to respond or write down their or have like written responses. We used various different mediums as well, such as WhatsApp. Having translation available, so we use British Sign Language translators and interpreters as well. It's important to consider the frequency of the meetings and make sure people have the flexibility to meet when they want, and to have pre-meets and debriefs as well after each session. And we worked with survivors from the beginning and throughout. So that was the writing of the strategy, the launch event, and the communication strategy. And then we're continuing to work with the same group on the procurement processes and kind of representation at different events and talking about the strategy. So in terms of our behaviour, we avoided inappropriate language and behaviour. So this was to avoid further trauma. So that involves not using jargon, complex words or acronyms, using the word survivor rather than victim, saying domestic abuse rather than domestic violence. We also had to create a safe space for engagement. So that means considering trauma, health and safety, and also addressing intersectionalities and creating a gendered approach. So that's applicable for all genders and non-binary as well. We also asked people what they wanted in order to ensure they felt safe in that kind of environment. We had various contributions that we put into place. Another important element is valuing their expertise through payment. So we have a reward and recognition policy, which is tied to the London living wage. We also covered care costs and travel expenses and made sure that there was refreshments and lunch and things like this available at meetings. And then there was a flexible commitment as well. So it really is up to the residents and survivors when they want to be involved, how they want to be involved. If they want to drop out because they're struggling and then rejoin, you know, they're not going to be penalized for that. It's about being flexible and meeting their needs and meeting them where they're at. We also offered therapeutic support. So that was following sessions. We also considered the long-term impacts of the work that they did. So that might have involved making
2 minutes left.
2 minutes, okay, perfect. Making referrals to longer-term mental health support. That's something that they felt that they wanted to engage with. And also considering their participation in future kind of learning and professional development as well. So we're kind of building a long-term relationship with people, which we hope to maintain over time. And then the last point on that slide is to highlight survivors' contributions in their own word. So we did this by having a foreword, which was written by a resident. The strategy priorities were created by the residents, and as well as the values. If you could go to the next slide, I've just taken an excerpt from the foreword, which was written by one of the survivors. So it says here, I wanted to share my views and co-produce a strategy because working together is the way forward to making the right changes. By being heard and valued as a survivor, my journey has become more rewarding. Co-production is about equality. It's about getting services right to be able to allow the user to gain back control of their lives. So I hope that shows the kind of reflection of their participation in the work that we're doing.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sophie, and thank you for keeping it to 6 minutes. So yeah, do ask Sophie any questions in the chat. I'm gonna hand over to Marcus now. Yeah, same for you, Marcus, 6 minutes, and I'll give you 2 minutes warning.
Cool. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marcus, and I'm the founder of Paying It Forward, Paying It Now, CIC, also known as PIFPIN. So PIFPIN is a community interest company rooted in Newham that supports local creative and entrepreneurial talent. Now, my previous experience as a senior community researcher was with an upskilled and paid community-led cohort with the Social Innovation Partnership, better known as TSIP. Also, those are the guys that you can see in the picture. We were working with UCL and Impact on Urban Health, which is a subsidiary of Guy's and St. Thomas's charity. And most of our work took place in working with Lambeth and Southwark Council. So my background with community research was we were upskilled to take part in research as community members. We did a whole bunch of research, but research started to get depressing for me once I was doing community responses to COVID-19 with frontline nurses who were threatened with losing their job because they didn't want to take the vaccine. And interestingly, the young... Hello? I was muted. The young people... Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. The young people I was working with, they got quite entrepreneurial and creative, and we wrote a report called the Disruptive Futures Report with an organization called A New Direction. And I actually became place-based in Custom House because I was telling my fiance about all of the great work I was doing in Lambeth and Southwark, saying that Newham didn't have anything. And she told me, you can never ever say that about Newham because I'm born and raised here, so you may as well be a part of the change. And that's how I found myself here. Next slide. So the community research to us was a way to link the experts to the people. So we talked to residents about their concerns in a way that academics might not. By upskilling community members to interview, survey, study, and write about their own communities, we empowered people who previously had no platform or valid voice in research. So I worked on including marginalized voices in research on air pollution, medical skepticism, parenting, and health activism. In terms of the outcomes, we published research in collaboration with the NHS, King's College, McPin Foundation, Gale Architects, and more. What made us different or successful was that we had a bespoke methodology to unpack the more hidden details in our communities that mainstream research struggles to bridge the communication gap for, because we understood how tired we are of being researched by strangers that we feel don't really care. So a clipboard and a mindset that wants to take more than you're giving back won't get you the results that you want in terms of community research. Next slide. So we took a bottom-up approach to connecting research to underserved communities, and we were able to build careers in research with people from non-traditional backgrounds. We did a lot of our community research online because of lockdown and just the face of the more digital world that we now live in. And we emphasized cross-cultural skills in language, relationships, location, and attitude in order to make our research really bespoke to the areas that we're working in. Next slide, please. So the three main takeaways I'd like you to have, this was our APC model, which is about accessibility. So picking community members and upskilling community members who have access to the hard to reach marginalized communities that you want to engage with. We had positionality, which meant that we had an in-betweener approach, meaning that we had community members that were sufficiently anchored within the community, but also were able to engage with front-facing research, and straddling that in-betweener line. Those were the community members that we felt were able to add the richest nuances in the work that we were doing. And credibility is to highlight that not all voices within the community can mobilize the community to take part in research, particularly for the fact that, as discussed before, research tends to be a bit of a polemic subject, particularly with communities with history of being excluded. Next slide, please.
Marcus. Yeah, and you've got 2 minutes left.
So one thing that we found, obviously, things aren't always going to go well. And we started to have miscommunications between the community cohort that we had upskilled and the corporate funder that was funding them. So, for instance, the corporate funder might take ages to respond to an email, feeling that they need to cross all their T's and dot all of their I's, yet the community would feel like you've gone cold on them. So just that little cultural difference in value systems actually led to quite a big miscommunication. So I co-created a safe space for individuals on both sides to discuss their cultural differences and how they approach the work and reflect on their own experiences, which we called race and reflectivity sessions. So we hired facilitation experts in diversity and fairer practices to lead the session in a balanced way. We engaged in active listening, empathy, and self-reflection. And through that, we came to an understanding that we are all in the same fight, though we had different approaches, and both Centric, which was the community-led research hub we created, and Impact on Urban Health, which is their main funder, formed a closer bond that hasn't since been broken. So that's definitely something to think about when you do research, engaging communities, that there's going to be communication differences. That's me.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Do ask Marcus any questions in the chat, and he'll be in the same breakout room with Sophie. Now we're going to move to the next theme around making equal research partnerships with communities. Oh, no, sorry, that was the previous one. The next theme is letting communities decide what to research. And Nalini and Caroline will be in the breakout room facilitating the discussion around this theme. I'm going to hand over to Nalini now to introduce herself and her work. Nalini, you've got 6 minutes, and I'll give you 2 minutes warning.
Okay, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name's Nalini Edwards. I'm a doctoral researcher on the Comrade Project at City University of London. The project's funded by the autism charity Autistica and is partnered with Cray at UCL. The project's key aim is to change research practices to make them more inclusive to autistic children with complex needs. There are 2 strands to the project. One is communication, the other is distress. And my research focus is to understand how distress, for example, anxiety and depression, is communicated by children with complex needs. Next slide, please, Diana. Thank you. To briefly summarise the group that we're looking at, which is autistic people with complex needs. Autism is a lifelong neurodevelopmental condition that's indicated by persistent differences in social communication and social interaction and restricted repetitive patterns of behaviour, interests or activities. Around 40%, sorry, next slide, please. Thank you. Around 40% of autistic people also have additional complex needs. That means that they could have significant language or intellectual differences, and they often are minimally verbal. That means they speak few or no words. This group is particularly vulnerable to experiencing forms of distress, which can have a considerable impact on their quality of life. However, because of perceived communication barriers, this group has been neglected in research. And as a result, the autistic community has identified mental health as a key research priority that they would like explored. Next slide, please, Diana. I want to, oh gosh, my slides, the font's changed on it, Diana. Have you noticed that?
No, maybe something has changed when I compiled them.
Yes, if I shared my screen, so it's a bit more.
Yeah, we can try that.
Yeah, that would be better. Bear with me. Can I share my screen?
Yeah, you can do that. You're a co-host now.
Okay, let me try this. That's a bit better. Okay. Now which did I get to? Okay, here. I got to here. Okay. So I want to touch upon some of the key challenges that we've faced in the project and how we've resolved them. The first was how to engage with the school community. Many of the staff and parents were reluctant to engage with us initially because of prior bad experiences with researchers. They felt that our research agenda would take a priority rather than being of a benefit for the children themselves. To address this, we immersed ourselves in the school community, spending time in the classroom with the children so that we wouldn't be strangers to them, and spending time talking to teachers and parents and the therapists within the school to shape our research to what could be meaningful to them. This experience also helped shape our research questions, as well as establish equal partnerships and, more importantly, trust. A key factor that helped both of us, both me and the other main researcher, is that we're both mothers to autistic children, which helped to instantly build a connection through shared lived experiences. Right. Another big challenge we faced was data collection. As autistic children with complex needs cannot communicate distress as perhaps we would, one way to understand if they're distressed is to monitor their heart rate. An increase in heart rate can be an indicator of physiological stress. We spent time with the children introducing them to the sticky sensors, and if anyone's ever had an EEG, those are sort of medical sensors that I'm talking about that normally are applied to the chest. The sensors were also available in the classroom and were given to parents. However, when we came to capture data, the children would repeatedly take them off, stick them on furniture, or try and eat them. Also, to capture heart rate data, the sticky sensors should ideally be placed on the chest. However, despite using an instructional video with one of our own children modelling the task, symbolic instructional language and social stories, the children simply didn't understand what we were trying to ask them to do, and so they couldn't really give consent or even assent. We also felt uncomfortable trying to attach the sensors to the chest of a vulnerable child, particularly in a non-clinical environment, because all of this research took place within the school. We did manage to collect heart rate data from 2 children who also had epilepsy, and this previous experience with wearing medical sensors may have helped. However, they showed no signs of distress, but showed joy instead. To resolve this challenge, we abandoned the idea of collecting heart rate data this way and decided to focus on the actual challenge of collecting this type of data from children with complex needs, which is not really covered in the research literature. I only found 2 papers on it covering this particular topic. It also widened the focus of our research. Instead of focusing on just distress, we also decided to include joy to get a richer understanding of mental well-being within complex needs. And we also added additional research questions, which involves co-design and co-production and development of a new biosensor that will be more inclusive, acceptable, and tolerable to the children. Can you change to the next slide, please, Diana? Oh, no, it's me.
Yeah.
Right, okay, so key takeaways. So key takeaways for me were to understand the participatory research process as non-linear. So if you can imagine research, particularly quantitative research, which is very structured as a very straight line, participatory research is more of a scribble because it's very, very messy and it often folds back on itself. And I also found the process of doing the research, particularly the biosensor work, was just as important as traditional research outputs. Next slide. Okay, so with this in mind, going forward to design the sensors and understanding the design process differently for this particular group, I've used an iterative methodology called design thinking to design the new biosensors, which will allow me to revisit the different stages because they fall back on themselves at different points in the research process when I need to. Okay, I think that's it.
Thank you so much, Nalini. And I'm gonna just hand over to Caroline now, and I'll do the same, Caroline, and give you 2 minutes warning. Caroline, are you with us?
Yes. Yeah, I'm just coming off of mute. I don't have any slides, so you're just going to have to listen to me and possibly see me. I work for an organisation called Compost London, and what we do is infrastructure work. We support and develop and encourage voluntary and community groups to become more sustainable and more viable. And through that work, I've done quite a lot of examples of where we've tried to create opportunities for researchers and the community to work together. And we've done that because I think it's really rich. and there's a knowledge exchange that goes on, and there's winners on both sides. And so researchers are able to access the sort of the grassroots of what they're researching, and the community groups are hopefully able to get some research that has been done in a structured and rigorous way that will enable them to plan the next steps for their community, the next project that they want to fund. But it's hard work and it's messy, and things always end up completely different to how you thought they were going to when they started. So what I thought I'd do is just go through some bullet points of what we've found from our experience. And the experience that we've had and what you've heard about is the Citizen Social Science project with UCL. We've also worked on the evaluation exchange that puts postgraduate researchers alongside groups that have an evaluation or an impact challenge and find ways to use research to collect and solve that. And recently we've worked with the National Institute for Health Research, who are trying to explore ways that more people from marginalised communities can get involved in health research, because it's not a level playing field. There's a lot of middle class people that are white and sign up for research, and so the research findings aren't truly representative of people that might have those things, those symptoms and reactions. So I think the first thing I would always say is that there must be a knowledge exchange. There has got to be give and take. You're going to do research with the community and not to the community. Therefore, both sides need to get something out of it. And there's got to be respect on all sides. You've got to understand that everybody has experience and everybody has knowledge, and that they're bringing those together. It's a different kind of knowledge and it's a different kind of experience on both sides of the equation, but it's valid. And if we're going to work together, we've got to respect that and understand it. If you're going to work with the community, as you've already heard from a number of people, there is often a lack of enthusiasm and trust. Most communities that are subject to research have been researched more than once. They've been round this circuit so many times and they've not been treated well.
Left, Caroline, sorry.
Okay. So you need to put in the time to build that trust and build that enthusiasm. And so therefore, as researchers, you're going to need to work a bit harder to show them why you want to come and research them, how you're going to work with them, what changes they might be able to get at the end of it, and to give them to promise and deliver on feedback. Think about the participation ladder. Don't start at the wrong end where you're just doing something to them. Co-design it with them, get them involved right from the beginning. If need be, use an intermediary. There are groups out there, and this is what we're planning to do with the Community Research Network. There are groups out there that are responsible and have care and respect and trust for the community that you want to research. If you work with that intermediary to get the introductions, use their safe spaces already, use that, it will be so much easier. And finally, the last thing I think everybody needs to remember is actually when you're working with communities, research isn't their day job. They've usually got a day job and they've usually got lots of things to fill their time, and you're an add-in. And I might be a very interesting add-in and they might get involved and want to carry on, but at the beginning of the process, you're an add-in. And therefore they aren't going to give you, oh yes, of course I'm free next week on Tuesday, because they might not be. So it works, you know, you need to negotiate all these things to get there, but it is really good if it works, and you'll get such rich data, and relationships just last forever. We started the evaluation exchange way back in 2015, and there are still researchers volunteering at community groups where they carried out the research with the people in those groups, and it just goes on and on. So it is worth the effort.
Thank you very much, Caroline. And do ask Caroline and Nalini any questions in the chat, and you can follow up with them in the breakout room discussing the theme, letting communities decide what to research. Now moving on to the final theme, using what communities know to make change. First, we've got Saffron and then Dom, who will both facilitate the breakout rooms for that theme. Over to you, Saffron, and I'll give you 2 minutes warning.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Really delighted to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Like Caroline, I'm not going to use any slides. I'm just going to talk a little bit, and much of what I'm going to say is reflecting on points that previous speakers have raised. So I just want to say quickly who I am. I'm the head of UCL's new Citizen Science Academy. I am based at the Institute for Global Prosperity at UCL. I work out of UCL East. I'm an anthropologist by training, which means I'm a researcher who's very interested in lived experience and storytelling, and trying to kind of foreground people's stories and experiences. And part of that work is about challenging the way that academics and universities and policymakers think about what constitutes knowledge, and think about the kind of evidence that they use to make decisions. So this is kind of at the heart of what I take to be being an anthropologist, but also one of the big principles of the Citizen Science Academy. I work at a university now, but I started my research career as a community researcher, working in Bristol on kind of environmental issues, and working in my neighbourhood and working with other kind of local groups who just couldn't get their voices heard in the context of decisions that were being made around planning. So that's kind of my background. So I kind of echo everything that all of the previous speakers have said about the principles of trust, building long-term relationships, making sure that any kind of research done with communities is with communities and is with citizens directly, and it's not being done to them. So I completely agree with all of those comments. And I think the Citizen Science Academy has been set up specifically to make the research process and the process of developing knowledge as inclusive as possible. So we try to spend a lot of time understanding what the barriers are to taking part in research for local communities and for groups from different backgrounds, and then trying to break those down. And that means thinking a lot about the power dynamics, that go on. So I just wanted to make a couple of points, because we talked a lot so far about the research process and the kind of principles of good and equal partnerships and producing knowledge together. I wanted to say a little bit about the kind of concept of capacity building, because what frustrates me a lot is that when policymakers and decision makers talk about communities and citizens, they often always discuss, they always kind of talk about communities as the ones that need capacity building. Whereas actually, I think if you want to make community-based research and citizen science something which is sustainable and a practice that can be embedded in the way that decisions are made about the decisions that affect people's lives, it's actually the organizations that are involved, local authorities, public agencies, developers, universities. It's the organizations that need capacity building and educating about the value of different types of knowledge, and thinking about how organizations need to kind of change the way that they work to properly support and recognize the contributions that citizen scientists and communities make. So quite a lot of the work the Citizen Science Academy does is to work with organisations like Newham Council, Camden Council and others to introduce ways of working. So I saw in the chats flashing up really quickly in front of me, but I saw a couple of points in the chat around, what are the kind of skills that community researchers need to be given, for example. So quite a lot of the work that we do in the academy is not necessarily about research methods. A lot of it is about responsible research and how you look after yourself in the field and how you work as someone who's going to be working perhaps in their community and dealing with very difficult issues, for example. Or what kind of infrastructure is needed to make sure that communities who are leading their own research can take ownership of that data and kind of look after it and manage it and be recognised for it in the long term. And one of the other points that was raised was around, do we need a co-designed code of conduct? And I would say yes, absolutely. And one of the things that the Citizen Science Academy has done with citizen scientists is design the academy in the first place through a co-produced process, but also think about a co-designed citizen science code of conduct. So what is it that organisations need to do to be a responsible research commissioner, to be a respectful research partner? So the onus is not always on, well, how do we kind of make sure that citizens and communities are capable of doing the research, which is a kind of condescending and patronising way of looking at it, which I hear a lot. So just want to kind of put that idea that actually it's the organisations who are working with citizens and community based researchers, they need as much capacity building and support as anyone else. I appreciate that's a really, really long and fast chat. I've got some general slides about the Citizen Science Academy that I will share with Ziala afterwards that can be circulated.
Yeah, perfect, amazing. Thank you so much, Saffron. I'll hand over to Dom to introduce himself, and Dom, I'll give you 2 minutes warning. Do you want to share your screen, or do you want me to share my screen? Dom, you're on mute.
I'll share my screen if yeah. So hang on, that's gone right to the want to start at the beginning. Can you see that?
Yeah.
I'll make that, hang on. Okay, just to say, I'm Don Murphy. I work in the participation team at Camden Council, and we're really very much about trying to enable the council or help the council learn how to be more participatory in its approach. So it's not about people participating in what we do, it's much more about us opening up to the people of Camden. So the issue about community research is a really vital part of that. I'm going to talk about two sort of things, but they mesh together. Good Life Camden it's basically our model. It's a new way of us being able to assess how the council is performing, and our partners. It's a gift to our partners as well, based upon the lived experience of our residents, and also based upon real impacts that they've identified, and also based on their research as well. So just a little bit of strategic context. I'll go through this very quickly. That the overall overarching narrative for change is a thing called We Make Camden, and we support that. So that's basically how we want to achieve change in the borough. That's supported by a regular report called the State of the Borough Report, and this Good Life Camden project supplies all that lived experience data into the report. So it's a very important part of our sort of annual planning cycle. So the context is that over the last few years, we've been working closely with residents and with staff to look at a framework that can tell people, that could describe what people of Camden see as the important elements of a good life. it's like replacing our normal things. I mean, the public health data here, I've mentioned GDP, but there's all sorts of, you know, basically official statistics that are normally used by a local authority to gauge whether or not it's making any progress. But the difference with this one is it's putting resident well-being up front and center, and making that not just us choosing well-being data, but relying upon what our residents are saying best describes their own well-being. And ultimately, this will be something that we believe will help us make better decisions, and also help us and our partners make better decisions that are informed by the needs of our residents. So informing this was back in 2020 was a piece of work we did with IGP, Camden Giving, Lend-Lease, and that was a piece of citizen social science in the area around Euston Station in response to HS2 and the massive regeneration that was happening. This is very similar to the other stuff that's happened in East London. We were looking at developing basically a good life model for the area of Euston, and to do that, we recruited 2 groups of residents. One, initially, the first group was a group of young people. I think that was really important to us. I have to admit, it was an accident that we did it this way around. It wasn't part of our planning, but it was a really important accident. And they got going and tested out the methodologies that we heard actually from Alexis, that Alexis described really well, that IGP taught the young people through the summer of 2020, and then they did their field work right through their summer holidays and ended it when they went back to school and to college or into work. That was followed at the end of the year and actually through the worst lockdown that we had, the big long winter lockdown, by a similar sized group of 11 residents aged between 18 and I think the oldest was 73, 74, something like that. So
sorry, Don, 2 minutes.
So they completed their research in May. The importance of this really, here's just a few little things describing them. There's a really brilliant innovative approaches that people came up with. The bottom right thing there is a smell map of Chorlton Street, which is one of the big streets that runs through the Somerstown area to right next to Euston. And the reason I put this up is that this process, and here's the model, the final model that which you'll get in the when we mail out these slides. The reason I mention all of this is that it really caught the imagination of the senior leadership at the council. So it was a really important sort of breaker of a log jam. That helped us go into the next phase, which was our community was to develop a version of Good Life Euston for the whole of the borough. Much, in a sense, more challenging in that the borough has such a diverse range of, just think about household income, massive difference between people who live in Hampstead and people who live around Euston, huge difference. How could you have a set of measures that would adequately describe the life of a typical Camdenite? So here's our timeline. One thing I did want to mention is that we started off in November of last year with a thing we called a What Matters Fair. It was basically, it wasn't even a fair, it was just a big event, really, a cultural event that we created into which we inserted some research, which was where people were asked to imagine their lives in the future and to describe what they thought was important, the most important things to living a good life in Camden. And it was a hugely feedback we got from it was fantastic. Lots and lots of local performers and residents. One of the tips I'd say here was using school children, because we got all their parents along. So we had loads and loads of curated music from schools and school kids, and that way we got a bunch of parents who wouldn't normally rock up to something like this. We've done, going very quickly through here, what at the end of this, so we had a process whereby after the fair, we worked with a group of 20 residents who workshopped gradually taking the results, the themes that came out of the fair, and starting to look at creating some indicators, what we call signals, and then some measures that would describe what these important details. And the 1, 2, 3, the fourth, that little sort of hexagon there, that's the emergent, the version 1 of our Good Life Camden model, which we're calling a Good Life Camden framework at the minute. Right, after all of that, so really that was just all the sort of like the first bit. Now we've actually got to start thinking about how on earth do we implement this. We've got the first version. Saffron, when we worked with Saffron in Euston, I think very quickly we went from version 1 to version 4 once we started socializing and actually talking to organizations about, how could this benefit you? Is there anything missing? That sort of thing. We immediately started iterating through quite a lot of changes. So we're in that phase now where we're just socializing, we're going to launch some pilots, we're working with local community organizations like North Camden Zone, Community Champions, all various different organizations and groups of residents that are thinking about their lives already. So it's not as if this was a brilliant new idea we came up with. Residents are thinking about this sort of stuff all the time. So it's very much about how we hook into this work. This is our sort of timeline, which again I won't spend too much time on, but it's a fairly sensible timeline of engagement, iteration. Then we'll publish a dashboard hopefully next year and continue constantly engage and iterate as we improve the measure and as we expose it to the public through the through that annual State of the Borough process. So you wanted me to do some tips. I mean, the first tip, I'm speaking from a council point of view here.
Please.
Is to relax. Because one of the things that this causes great tension amongst certain parts of the public sector. Buy in at senior level, use the local network specifically for your recruitment, pay people. That Alexis, I think, talked about that. It's really important. We got very good feedback from that. Support people while they're doing their research and provide pathways into social action. When you do this research, often people have got a thing that is really dear to them, that they feel, right, I feel now empowered to get on with that. We mustn't just leave them in a vacuum. Find pathways, support them in those pathways into social action and of course into work. And then we formed a citizens panel really out of all the different bits of deliberative and participatory research that we've been doing. There are people who say, yeah, we want to stay doing this. We want to carry on doing it. And the panel now is about 500 members and we regularly use them. That's it.
Thank you so much, Dom. Do ask Dom and Saffron any questions in the chat and follow up with them in the breakout room. I'm gonna move quickly to our last two speakers. We've got Malta and Nicola. Gonna let them introduce themselves and their projects in relation to the theme they will facilitate in the breakout room, which is around developing research approaches and methods that fit communities' culture. First Malta and then Nicola. Malta, you've got 6 minutes. Oh, let me just quickly share my screen.
You're going to share the screen? Yeah, okay. Yeah. Okay, yes, hi everybody. I know it's a lot to take in, getting to know 10 different research projects at once, but yeah, I hope people still have some capacity to take in what I'm going to talk about. So I actually come from the research side. So I work for the Center for Trust, Peace and Social Relations at Coventry University, and together with Susanne Wessendorf, we've been carrying out this research in Newham for almost 2 years now. And yeah, I'd like to tell you a little bit about it. Next slide, please, Diala. The one before. Sorry. Yeah. So our research is titled Arrival Infrastructures and Migrant Newcomers in European Cities, right? And I'm just going to give you a brief overview about what we mean by that, because that's quite significant to the type of like more participatory community-led aspects that we also have in our research, right? So what do we mean by arrival infrastructure? So I think historically, the study of migration has sort of like departed from looking at people on the move. So what are people doing when they move from one place to another, right? And I think a lot of attention has been given, especially to these ideas of push and pull factors. So kind of like what makes people migrate, what pushes them out of certain places, and what draws them into other places, right? And I think what we're trying to do here is something very different. So arrival infrastructures looks first and foremost at the networks that already exist on a neighborhood level when newcomers arrive, right? And we specifically focus on so-called arrival neighborhoods. So these are those parts of town that have a long history of welcoming people. And Newham is a very good example of this. We can see how many different generations of people have arrived in Newham, right? But instead of then looking into how newcomers and how they go about their arrival processes, we start by looking at the networks and structures that have been already created in decades before, right, by these diasporic communities and through their own arrival, right? So this doesn't mean that it's not that we're not interested in what newcomers do, but rather our approach is a bit different, right? So we start with the mobilities and looking at what exists already on the neighborhood level. So rather like the things that are rather static rather than the things that move, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that arrival infrastructures to us is not a theory, but it's a lens or a perspective or an approach to how we want to study mobilities or migration. Next slide, please. So what does that mean concretely? So what I do a lot is I volunteer a lot. I look into like kind of like these supported structures from the inside, and that's been ongoing since 2 years. I'm very involved with the renewal program, which is on High Street North in Eastham, a charity that provides all kinds of support to people in the neighborhood. Next slide, please. And I'm quite involved here in the food bank specifically. I've been volunteering there since 2021. Next slide. And also I've been doing, you see, I go through these slides quickly. And also I've been doing a lot of ESOL teaching there. Next slide, please. At Kensington Primary School, that's just on Kensington Avenue, also in Eastham. So there's a kind of like a little bit of a focus on Eastham as a neighborhood. I work alongside the EAL lead on ideas of like multilingual education, and there's a lot of like workshops and things that come out of this. And all of these things, I also work together with St. Martin's of Tours Church in Plaistow. And all of these things is what we call participant observation, right? And that means I'm getting involved in already existing structures, in already existing initiatives to learn how they work, right? And what they do. Next slide, please. We also conduct surveys and different types of mapping exercises with shopkeepers on the high street, on High Street North, and ask them whether people actually come in and ask them for help, people who are relatively newly arrived in the country. And that gives us a little bit of like an insight into the more informal infrastructure. So on the one side, there are these like formal institutions, and on the other side, we have these informal structures, right? Next slide, please.
2 minutes now. Topic.
Yes, good. So the actual topic of today, right? Our project was not designed as a participatory or community-led piece of research, right? But I think participation and these kind of ideas of tipping these balances of power in the participants' favor is almost inevitable when we conduct an immersed study like this. It's something that I call, or many people would call, ethnography, right? So participant observation over a long period of time leads to then the building of relationships, sort of deep relationships with people and organization and spaces in Newham, and it opened up different opportunities to carry out activities that were more participatory, right? So for example, this project here was called Arrival Stories, a participatory photography and storytelling project, which gave kind of like newly arrived ESOL students at the renewal program the chance to tell their own story through photography and writing, right? And the agenda here was completely set by the participants, and decisions about the exhibition and the process were also made by them, right? So there is an aspect here of giving these otherwise marginalized voices a platform to tell their stories, right? And I think an important takeaway here is that the role the arts and other forms of creative expression can actually play when we're trying to conduct research in a different way, because it allows for knowledge to be produced in a more creative and accessible way, right? And then the last slide. And I think one of the things that I find quite interesting is in research, it's sometimes difficult to actually clearly define who your participants are and who is that community that you are trying to facilitate the participation for, right? So in our case, we work a lot with newcomers, but we also work a lot with community work practitioners, right? And some of these relationships have really turned into long-term collaborations. For example, at the renewal program, I work very closely with a number of people, among them Beverly, who should also be here today. She has really become part of our research project. We planned and facilitated focus groups together, and Beverly was also part of a small group that came with us to Dortmund in Germany, where we had a knowledge exchange, practitioner exchange activities with our partners. And these ideas kind of like shape a lot of what our research actually looked like and the relationships, right? So what I want to summarize at this point is that like participatory and community-led research was not the core of our project, but this co-producing knowledge is inevitable when we work in an immersed way with marginalized groups. And it's just a matter of finding creative ways to give these types of knowledge productions a space. And they very much rely on the building of long-term ethical and collaborative relationships. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Malta. Please put questions to Malta in the chat. I'm going to hand over to Nicola, our last speaker for today, before we move into breakout rooms and open to the Q&A. Nicola just joined us, and I appreciate your time, Nicola. Over to you, if you can please introduce yourself and your project, and I'll give you 2 minutes warning.
Thank you. Are you going to share the slides or?
Yep.
Oh, yes, perfect. Thank you. So hi, everybody. I am Nicola. I'm part of something called Co-Production Collective. We're based at University College London, UCL, but we are a kind of community of people, I guess you would call us, made up of people with all types of experience, whether that's lived or learned. So there are people from the local community, there are patients in the hospitals around UCL, but also nationally and internationally, our community. And then there's researchers, practitioners of all sorts. We ourselves are co-produced in that we were developed by a mixed group of people from all backgrounds, sharing the decision-making and moving forwards together. If you can go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. And we now work to support others to co-produce research, service development, and also policy development. For us, co-production is about an approach to working together in equal partnership for equal benefit. And what we find that's really, really important when working in this way with really diverse groups of people is our core values that underpin this approach. So if you could go on to the next slide, please. These core values are about being human, inclusive, transparent, and challenging. And we really try to live and breathe these. So for us, co-production is a mindset. It's not a framework or a kind of list of things we pull off a shelf and we tick a few boxes and job's done. You know, we really do have to embody these values in order to work with anybody, but in particular to work with really diverse groups who may not be able to sit in a meeting or engage using their voice. You know, we really try to think creatively and embody these values. So that means that we provide multiple ways to get involved in what we're doing. And we always try to work hand in hand with those of our community when doing different pieces of work. So it's never a member of UCL working only on a project. We always have members of our community doing it with us. In the spirit of needing to not take too long, I guess we might go on to the next slide if that's all right. So we did a piece of research recently that was co-produced about what is the value of co-production, because we regularly face pushback on this. Oh, it's a nice way of doing things. Isn't it soft and lovely and fluffy? And we don't agree. And as a community, we're really trying to champion culture change in the space of research, service development, and policy development. And so having some evidence to try to back up that has proved really beneficial with funders, with organizations. So the research brought out lots of things that, you know, probably aren't that new to you as a group here, but it's really important that it's in one place, and also that that research is available in a variety of ways. We have videos, we have short summaries, we have long 80-page summaries, if that's the type of thing that you like. And we also have it available in Braille, in a screen reader friendly version, in DAISY and EPUB, in all sorts of versions, to try and really do the opposite of what academic research often does, which is a very inaccessible 100-page document that's lots of fancy words and nobody understands. So we really try to think differently and address things. And I've just seen Caroline from Compost. Hey, Caroline. So if we could go on to the next one. Thank you. This was just to highlight the part of the discussion that Malta and I are focusing on, which is methods that you've seen that work well for capturing diverse cultures and viewpoints. I mean, I would talk about methods that work well for working with people from diverse cultures and viewpoints rather than us capturing their kind of views, but you know, and then how can we make sure that projects are designed and carried out in a way that respects and incorporates cultures, values, ways of life, etc. I'm going to probably move on if Diala, how am I doing for time?
Still have 1 minute and a half.
Whoa, okay. So let's skip that one and we'll move on to an example of and the next one. We can share these with people afterwards, right?
Yeah.
So this is a piece of work that we have been involved in, which is a group of women from, it's a Black and minoritized voices group of women who got involved in a co-production piece of work in a particular borough of London and really struggled because their voice was not listened to and power was taken away from them, and they were really disillusioned with that. And so they came to us because we were providing funding for some small pilot projects, and they applied for that funding and they did a piece of work using really creative methods to engage with mothers in this particular borough around what they found really challenging in terms of maternity services. And they performed in a town hall using this theatre, and they showcased all the challenges through theatre, which was a really eye-opening and engaging way of people from all sorts of different backgrounds having a conversation about what was challenging and what they needed to change without having to sit around a meeting room table and express things in ways that they might have not been able to. They could use theatre and acting and different kind of creative ways to express themselves, which was really, really impactful for those women, but it was very important for gathering the information and doing that piece of research together. I think you can go on to the next one. There you go. Am I in my time? This is amazing. Yeah. So please, the community that is Co-Production Collective is open to everybody. We're a really mixed group of people who come together with a shared passion for co-production. So please, if you want to get involved, you're very welcome. We have a newsletter and we also have a massive resource library that is open to everybody to use that includes everything from academic literature to blogs, to videos, so that's it, I think. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nicola, and thank you to all our speakers for their interesting talks. I'm just conscious of time. I'm gonna hand over to Catherine and we'll open to the Q&A. We've got 10 minutes to take questions from attendees. Just gonna stop sharing my screen.
Hi everyone. So I've been jotting down some of the questions that were asked in the chat, but quite a lot of them have been answered already. So I just wanted to, first of all, I think some new people have joined. So just to say that we've had presentations so far from the main speakers, and we've got a Q&A session now for about 10 minutes. And then we're going to go into a breakout room. So Diala's just sorting those out now for everyone. So does anyone have any questions? I don't know if you want to raise your hand. Otherwise, there's one or two that I think could do with answering. So yeah, I'll just leave it if anyone's got anything they wanted to ask. It could be to everyone who's presented. It could be to a specific speaker. Okay, someone's got their hand up. I can see. Saida?
Hi there. I just wanted to ask a question to the gentleman who did a study in Newham working with migrants. I'm afraid I can't remember the gentleman's name, but I just wanted to understand in terms of the parameters that they sort of took into account, because one of the things that, so I'm from an organization called SheWise, and we work with South Asian women in areas of domestic abuse, mental wellness, and skills development. But one of the things we find is that a lot of women who come to us often have trauma. And having now been working with women in that space for a while, we realize a lot of this trauma is migration trauma and generation trauma and trauma from escaping from violence, and because often sometimes these women are refugees and they come from these countries. I was wondering then, is there any scope within their research to take migration trauma into account, or possibility of doing research on that? Because I think it's a huge area that's being neglected, especially when it comes to refugees. I think it's something that needs to be taken into account when we're creating policies and stuff at governmental level. There's just not enough funding at grassroots levels to tackle with issues around trauma for migrants and refugees. So I just really wanted to really just make that comment, really, and see if there's anything that's being done out there in reference to this that we can hook on to and do and add value to, because we feel it's a huge area that's being missed.
Thanks for that. I think
I
think
I think I'm the gentleman, right? Yeah. So yeah, thanks for that question. Certainly. So I think maybe I didn't make myself clear. I think one of the reasons, especially also why we're trying to do research in the way we do, is in order not to push newcomers to retell their arrival story if they don't want to, you see, by looking at the structures that are already there to support them, right? And there's a lot of things happening on the ground. So we are not specifically focusing on mental health, but obviously it plays a huge role because it's one of the, so you can infrastructures, you can understand that as very practical things. So for example, I don't know, how do you get access to resources, schools, community centers, food banks, etc. But there's also something that you might as well call emotional infrastructures or infrastructures of care that definitely exist. And what I find quite interesting is they often exist in the non-institutionalized sector, right? They exist in, you know, it's kind of like family, friends, faith, communities, etc. That's where oftentimes that work is being done. So that's what we're trying to flesh out in terms of mental health. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
There was also one question which was posed in the chat, and I think this was more broadly to all panelists, really. And that was, are there ever any challenges communicating your findings back to decision makers? So I don't know if anyone wanted to take that question. Oh. Saffron, unmute, yeah.
It's I think that's a really important question. I wasn't going to say so much, so I wasn't going to focus so much on communicating findings back. I think one of the challenges is making sure that the that there's a suitable infrastructure to take those findings seriously and take them forward, which is, I think, connects to what I was trying to say earlier about the capacity building that organizations need to respond, to understand how to properly work with citizens and with communities. So I think getting a kind of point of contact to feed research findings back is often not difficult, but making sure that there's then some kind of process to see those findings properly acknowledged or embedded in policy or strategy or planning or kind of future investment priorities, I think is where some of the challenge lies around making these ways of working sustainable.
Thank you. Nalini, would you like to come in as well?
So for the work I'm doing at the Compost project, it's funded by Autistica, so and it's exploratory in nature. And so I don't really have a problem in terms of butting heads with the decision makers or our funders. But we did have some quite difficult conversations with parents initially, because I think they saw us as psychologists, as in therapists, rather than research psychologists. And I think trying to get them to understand the difference between the two and manage expectations was really challenging. But no, in terms of funding and I suppose the decision makers, it wasn't so much of an issue, but definitely in terms of the other members of the who are essentially became our co-designers, our co-researchers, but it was just about very carefully managing expectations at the beginning so that people weren't disappointed later on.
Thank you. Nicola, would you like to come in?
Can I just double check what the question was? Because I had to run to the bathroom. I'm sorry, but was it around like, how do you deal with decision makers not agreeing with your approach or something like that? Was that the...
Sorry, I'll just jump in because it was my question. I guess I was just wondering, I'm relatively new to this space and you're all doing such amazing work, but after you've kind of got your findings and your takeaways, and presumably there's someone who you want to then influence with these findings. So it could be that actually the project's been funded and you just kind of need to get the findings back to that organization. But perhaps even if that is the case, there are other policymakers or decision makers who you'd love to kind of learn from your takeaways. Do you ever struggle to get your research in front of them? Or even if you do get in front of them, you know, how do they respond? Or I suppose I'm just wondering, are there things maybe that you could do or challenges that you face in just kinds of making sure that the great work that you've done is reaching and resonating with the people who you need it to reach and resonate with? Or is there like a sort of gap there where, I don't know, maybe people aren't quite responding the way that you'd like them to?
Yeah, I mean, so I thought that's kind of what it was about. Definitely there's a challenge for us. Like I continually butting heads, let's say, with senior people, whether that's in the university or in the projects that we're a part of. And there's a lot of, don't know if others ever come across this, but the kind of gaslighting type situation where you're made to feel like you don't really know what you're talking about. And, you know, oh, you're just a silly little person in the corner. Why are you telling me how to create, I don't know, impact in research, for instance? Or I find that I have to speak in 2 different languages, you know, and I'm not talking about, you know, from different countries. I have to speak in a certain way when it comes to senior management to try to get the point across that we're trying to make, that actually they can understand in the same way when we're co-producing, but they refuse not to for whatever reason, you know, because it's not quite in the right language. And if I can switch to that, I find that helps. The other thing is the evidence piece. That's why we did the value of co-production research, because it gave us some data, some information, some numbers. And that I find, along with money, seems to talk the right language for senior.
Thank you. Thanks, Nicholas. So we've got, we'll come up almost at time now, but I know Caroline and Dom, you both got your hands up. So I don't know if you just wanted to say something both quickly, and then I think we'll move into the breakout sessions. Thanks.
Dom, do you want to go first or shall I?
No, I think you had your hand up first.
Okay, so I think the key thing is, if you've done some community research, you owe it to the people that you worked with to carry on until they know the results. But I think it's what you do with it afterwards, because it's not just of interest to those people. There's, I mean, this very session shows you how much interest there would be in what might have been done, not only with the findings, but the methodology. So I think it's really important that the findings are very accessible, and that's not just where you put them, but also how you can access them. And, you know, there was an example of a play or a picture or something, and use intermediaries. If it's about a community, find somewhere in that community where everybody goes and put it on the notice board, or have it in a newsletter that goes round to all those type of groups and that. So I think it's about not just the community you were working with, but other communities that can learn from it, and therefore they need to be able to find it and understand it.
Yeah, I think that's right. Just very quickly, one of the things I really liked about the course that IGP had put together for the citizen social scientists was there was an element of it which was about communicating findings, about presenting, about public speaking and that sort of thing. I think that's like that ongoing support I mentioned in my presentation. And it's amazing the difference actually. I think when we put Soraya, who was one of our sort of star researchers, if you like, in front of the heads of planning, she just bowled them over, you know, because this is my research, this is how we did it, and they almost couldn't almost couldn't ignore it. And similarly, a group of the citizen scientists, didn't they, Saffron? They went to the senior sort of people's away day at Lend-Lease, the developers, and wowed them again, you know, so I think they're actually using the knowledge has been generated by the residents, the citizens, and so why shouldn't they be the ones that actually deliver that knowledge to the key people? And actually it has a power that I couldn't give it.
And just to kind of add really briefly, Catherine, I know we're short of time. I completely agree with Dom's point, but what he hasn't mentioned is the infrastructure that's needed to make those connections, which is a really important part, which at the moment is kind of like falling on Dom and the shoulders of his team to make sure that, you know, there's still people making connections, that there's still the funding available to make sure that citizen scientists are paid for all of those opportunities. So that infrastructure bit to make it all sustainable is really, really important.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we've got, that's all amazing insights. Thanks so much. Just to say that if there's any other questions that come up that you think of, you can always pop it in the chat. And at the end of, in a couple of weeks' time, we're going to compile all the questions, answers, get more answers from speakers if needed. So yeah, we will be sharing back all these great insights and questions. And I think there'll be a chance to talk a bit more around this theme as well in the using community research to make change a breakout room. So Diana, how are we doing with the breakout rooms? Are we almost good to go, do you think?
Yeah, I can open them now.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, thank you.
Okay, they're open. I'm just going to ask our speakers to go to their page on the Jamboard, and on their page they will discuss the questions with participants and write down answers next to each question. Also, Sophie, I couldn't add you because you're the main host. Can you please join the theme on making equal research partnerships with communities?
Yeah,
the third one.
Sure, doing that now.
Yeah. And Nalini, you should be in theme 4. Oh, perfect. Let's go. Brilliant. Let me just pause the.
You're trying to see if there's a way of cutting down on the time, but it's actually quite difficult to redo the breakout rooms second time because we need some time to do that. Yeah.
Oh, no worries.
So maybe what if I'm not sure, is everyone back yet? Okay, I'll wait till all the facilitators are back.
They should close in 20 seconds.
Okay.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Hello.
Everyone. Sorry, you've probably been put maybe in the middle of some great conversation. We've pulled you out of it. But yeah, we're just conscious we we've only got 30 minutes left. So at this point in the agenda, what we're going to do is have a little bit of a recap from each facilitator, from each breakout room, just to provide some sort of key points that were discussed. If you could kind of try and keep that within like even a minute or a minute and a half for each room, that'd be brilliant, because then we have a bit more time to discuss things in the second breakout room. We're just conscious, don't want to overrun too much, and you might have things that you need to get to at 4:30. So in terms of, I'm just going to choose people if that's okay. So for the working with communities to do research, Alexis or Juliet, would you be okay to just summarize a few key points that were discussed?
Yeah.
So, Juliet, do you want to do a few minutes very quickly, and I'll just
yes.
add to it?
So we were thinking about how we can build trust with communities if they don't want to do research. And we've talked about the importance of actually recognizing the past and acknowledging that things have not maybe been done the best way they could have been, and sort of having a healing process with our communities, kind of start the process of regaining that trust. And we've acknowledged that there has been a breakdown in the feedback loop in terms of what happens post research processes, and thinking about how that could be changed. There was also a conversation about the culture that we live in at the moment in terms of our society, in terms of our political experiences, where there are a lot of lies and certainly not enough accountability, and how can we build trust within our local communities when the wider environment isn't representing that and that tension. And we talked about sort of looking at participatory democracy and how we can use that as a tool to build trust within our communities. And then when it comes to sort of how we can work with partners, we talked about resourcing as a fundamental, and also accessibility. And how do we ensure that people who don't speak maybe the tongue here can actually be part of holding decision makers or researchers accountable when agreements are made. We talked about potentially a co-design process with a charter. We even went as radical as having some potentially penalty clauses within that, and someone can add on to that comment later. And also the importance of understanding power structures, because there are very complex systems at play. So when we think about partnership, that has to be recognised within the process. And Alexis, I'm sure you have a few points to add to that I missed.
Right, so just for it to it's very quickly, is some of the sort of how, what, when that we talked about is that a lot of the community don't have trust with the council, and so they feel, you know, that the council's there to take their data or do something a bit mischievous. So it's about building that relationship and having maybe meeting councillors a bit more often. And also looking at access avenues, like how can they access resources, what are the avenues to access resources. So those were some of the things that came out.
Great. Sorry, I might have to interrupt you there, just because I've just got 2 minutes.
Okay, then that's fine.
For the next round, for the feedback of the next round, maybe if there's anything else you want to add, you could add it at that stage. So could I go to so I think Nicola and Malte from the Developing Research Approaches Methods. One of you like to just feedback briefly?
Yeah, I was just trying to, I hope you guys can see this so that you have like a brief overview over, you know, kind of like what we talked about. So ours was more about like, you know, kind of like the cultures. Sorry, somebody has like a lot of background noise. Thank you. So it was kind of like about kind of like the cultural embeddedness of the research methods itself, and what kind of like, you know, cultural conflicts can maybe arise in the process of doing research like this. And I think what I found really interesting was a comment on body language. So kind of like how you communicate certain things that as a researcher you want to get across. I think the acknowledgement that doing research is always a weird situation I found quite interesting. It's not a natural kind of like thing that you think in those terms, and that you sit people down and ask them certain types of questions. So that needs to be acknowledged, and maybe thinking about ways of how to make it maybe more natural and maybe more part of like an everyday act. I think internal dynamics in communities are really important as well. That was highlighted by a lot of people in our breakout group. So who is actually the community members, and where you obviously you have oftentimes people who are very vocal, but those are not necessarily the ones that you need to always be speaking to, right? And that's kind of like when research starts from a bottom up, you always have to acknowledge that people will try to claim speaking for a community, but that never encapsulates the whole, right? So, and I thought one of the interesting things was as well, you know, like the time that's needed to build those relationships and a shared interest. So when researchers and participants actually share an interest because they maybe live on the same estate, or they maybe, you know, are affected by the same issue, then there is automatically a different, you will automatically like conduct research in a different way, right? Just because you will also be affected by its outcomes, you know? So I thought those were a couple of like really interesting points. I don't know if Nicola has anything to add.
No, I think you summed it up perfectly. Thanks, Walter.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's brilliant. Thanks for that summary. So next up, Marcus and Sophie.
Yeah, so I'll just read off of some of the sticky notes we have. So our first question was around what is a fair and helpful research relationship. So we started with co-production with clear expectations set right at the beginning, the community needing to be involved at every single step, and communicating openly and clearly that you value the community's insight with accessible language so that they feel that you're not just extracting from them. So the majority of that conversation was around rebalancing power differences in the relationships between all stakeholders, and also researching which approaches work best for which communities. So trying to do some qualitative and quantitative analysis around the different actual processes themselves. And in terms of our second question, we were dealing with how can we deal with power differences in community research relationships. So we quite heavily went into discussion around training and immersing yourself to responsibly engage in the world that you're actually researching. Are there facilitating tactics that could make things feel more equal, make things feel more equal in order to break down the us versus them dynamic? Cultural appropriateness and sensitivity, what's okay to you might not be okay to others. Establishing an understanding of where the extreme line and the average mean views are. And it's important to go, as somebody had said before, beyond the most vocal people so that you can get a fairer, more broad view.
Brilliant. Thanks for that summary. That's so helpful. So yeah, so the next one, Caroline or Nalini, would you like to share back what you discussed in letting communities decide what to research?
So actually, there's an awful lot of crossover with what Marcus has just said. In terms of the first question, we had quite a discussion on power relations and who holds the power, who sets the agenda for research, and if it's not the community and it's a funding body or an organisation that makes decisions or holds decision-making power, the role they play and the role that the communities can play in terms of setting the agenda and asking research questions, and also the kind of process and understanding where and how communities can kind of understand what value they bring to each stage of the process, and making sure that they're not just involved in the data collection process, but involved in every single process, including data analysis. In terms of the second question, we're talking about how we can facilitate the engagement of community-led partners in terms of being equals, so making sure that they have payment and they were given an equal priority or an equal footing in the research process, and also that, you know, unplanned things can happen in the research process, and understanding that that is valuable, not just the research output, and also making sure that key stakeholders who hold decision-making power are kind of with it to the end in some way, because I think that one of the members in the group kind of talked about projects that were where key decision makers were involved right up until the very final point where findings should have been delivered, and I thought that was incredibly disappointing for people involved, but also that there's a value in the research process and that people gain skills throughout it, whether or not the findings were shared. I think that's about it, really.
Brill, thank you so much. So for the last but not least, oh,
sorry, I didn't know if Caroline wanted to add anything to anything I'd said.
No, I think that was a good summing up.
Oh, Brill.
Thank you.
So last but not least, Dom or Saffron, would one of you like to share back what you discussed in the using what communities know to make change?
Yes, so we were talking about what are the ways of working to put community knowledge into action and to policy, and making sure that change happens. The conversation ended by, so I'll start at the end. The conversation kind of ended by talking about how it's organizations need to be very deliberate in the way that they think about the kind of the long-term processes that are needed, basically. So yes, it's important to kind of fund and properly resource this kind of work in the actual kind of research process, but also beyond that, we need to make sure that there's appropriate resource, whether that's funding or it's having posts created to make sure that that knowledge is transferred from organization to organization, that communities and citizens who were involved in the research are given a role in kind of championing that research in the long term as well, so that there are proper resources to take part in presentations, to present to policymakers, to be involved in the kind of like owning and telling the story of the research over time. But that is not just about project funding. That needs a much more kind of like deliberate and long-term approach to knowledge transfer. Dom, do you want to add anything to that? You're on mute.
There was also the role of intermediaries, wasn't there? We had a sort of discussion about the role of intermediaries, which could be intermediary organizations, community organizations, that sort of thing, that can help with building the long-term sort of link between this sort of community research and action happening. And of course, action isn't only going to be taken by the council. Action can be taken by community organizations and networks, as is happening as a result of the some of the Good Life Euston work.
And then the last thing was just, we had a conversation around what kind of constitutes resources, recognizing that money is important, but sometimes putting in other kinds of resources can be as valuable and have kind of like longer term effects as well. So we talked about volunteers and volunteering and the kind of role that volunteers can play in the long term in terms of helping to mobilize knowledge. So yeah, that's a very quick summary.
Thank you. Brill. So I think now we've got about 20 minutes left of the session. So I think probably what we're going to have to do is, Diala, how are you doing in terms of breakout rooms?
Yeah, we're ready to go.
We're good to go. Yeah. So I think probably we're only going to be able to have about 10-15 minute discussion. I'm not sure there's going to be time for feedback at the end, but I'll tell you about next steps, because we want to make sure that everything that's discussed will be shared. So that is something we're going to promise to you. But yeah, Diala, would you like to kick off with the breakout rooms?
And the link to the second Jamboard is in the chat. Dom, you should be in. Okay. I just want to thank Catherine. Nicola has to leave at 4:30 sharp. She's got another meeting.
I think that's okay, because I think as long as she's there for the facilitation.
Yeah, I'm gonna put 15 minutes for this round.
Okay, and then I was thinking maybe we don't do the report back at the end. What do you think?
Yeah, we can always. I uploaded the first Jamboard as PDF, and we can do the same for the second one. But be good to hear from people. Like for example, they're just putting key points, and it's good to know. Yeah, it's good to know like the expansion and the idea behind these points.
Okay, yeah, maybe we should just try and do that. We might have to overrun by about 10 minutes or something.
Yeah, maybe if we can,
maybe 1 minute of the next steps basically at the end. Just quickly in terms of the
maybe we'll be 2 or 3 minutes over time. That's all. We still have.
If they come back at 25, then there's only like 5 minutes to feedback at the end. And that took like, that definitely took over 10 minutes just to get everyone to feedback.
Then we can definitely skip the second recap. Let's do that. Let's skip the second recap, or maybe if they can do it in 1 minute.
Yeah, maybe just do it in 1 minute. Just say like if there's just like a few. Maybe we could ask everyone. We can just say, look, we're conscious Nicola needs to leave. Would people find it more valuable for us to just do a recap of what was discussed first, to do, and then? So just a quick one, that we're conscious we're running over time and we've only got 3 minutes left. And I wanted to just hear feedback from you whether you'd be able to, if you wanted to stay on for another extra 10 minutes, and then we'd have time to hear back what people have discussed in those rooms. But if you're not able to stay, I know, Nicola, you need to leave in 3 minutes. But yeah, just be helpful to know whether you'd rather we finish now in the next 3 minutes and I'll just go straight to next steps, or whether you could stay on a bit longer and you'd value hearing what was discussed in the other breakout sessions, and then we'll do that. Don't know if anyone has any thoughts. And facilitators, if you also have an extra 10 minutes or not to provide.
I can stay on for a bit longer.
I can as well, just for 10 minutes to finish off.
Yeah, I can.
Me too.
Yeah, me too.
I've got to go, unfortunately, but yeah, I'll catch up.
Okay, cool. Well, we're going to record this bit anyway, so obviously we're going to share that around. Great. So from the first session,
sorry, Catherine, maybe we'll start with Nicola.
Okay, yeah. I mean, Nicola, would you like to try and do a roundup in 2 minutes if you want, or if you want to skip now, you can do that.
No, I'll give it a go, but Malta, Phil and the group, feel free to input. Okay, so we were talking about what problems and solutions come up when we change research methods for different cultures, and also how do traditional academic research methods limit diversity. We discussed mostly on the second one. We talked a lot about language barriers, complex terminology that's used, and often people don't understand and are left sort of without explanation. There's a thing around kind of outreach work not being done particularly well, and terms like hard to reach being bandied around, when, I mean, my response to that is, well, actually, I don't think it's the communities that are hard to reach, it's the researchers or others not trying hard enough to engage people in different ways. And then trying to think about different ways of doing things and more hands-on ways of working, rather than kind of only having conversations in a kind of sterile focus group type environment, but trying to be creative and think differently. And then we talked about the fact research has a culture of its own. It's very historical, and a lot of challenges inbuilt into it that need challenging for change, I would say, but we're not there yet. Malta, what else?
It's just what I think you summarized it very well. It's just one of the pleas that I always usually throw into the discussion, is kind of like the different types of knowledge that exist, because I think academic knowledge, in the way it's set out with its own historical background and coming from a very particular place in the world as well, caters only for basically rational, kind of like reproducible positivist knowledge, right? And all these other forms of like ancestral knowledge or embodied knowledge or sensorial knowledge are really not marginalized in the research project process itself. And when we work with people on the ground, most people don't necessarily make up the truth, but or come to the truth by just thinking about it, but rather also by feeling it, by rather also experiencing it. So how can we build that into a research project is a really, really tricky question, but one that I'm really interested in.
Thank you. Was anything else you want to add from that, discussion? Otherwise, we can move on to the next. I can move on to the next. So working with communities to do research. Alexis, would you like to summarize some of what your group spoke about?
Okay, so can you see this screen that I've just got in front of me?
Yes.
Yes.
You can see, okay.
Yeah.
So basically the question that we focused on was how can we work together as partners in research? And in summary, what came out is the idea to respect, you know, the community assets and ideas. So things like the way that the community groups do things culturally and their cultural exchange. So what ideas do they have? How do they go about doing those things? Taking into consideration, obviously, religion, religious aspects and other reasons, and maybe food and how they go about doing things. Another idea around working with in partners, both the community and other collaborators, is having online resources and community building models that the community can learn from, and also there's a sort of a knowledge exchange. Other bits that were mentioned, which was quite interesting, and I think it was from Julie, she talked about researchers partnering together to co-design questions to save time, because what a lot of community people feel is that they've been asked questions over and over again by different groups, and sometimes they're a bit reluctant to respond to those. So how about researchers getting together, whether it's monthly or whatever, with some ideas and actually co-designing questions that all collaborative partners can benefit from, and maybe less sort of groups asking questions to community people. And Julie mentioned something about 16 sacred principles, which is some world principle that 4 worlds have discovered. I'm yet to go online and have a little research on these principles, but it sounds really interesting. And maybe these principles, maybe we can develop some sort of principles around that, so you can see that. And another thing that was mentioned as well is the idea that we need to be needing to meet the community at their own terms, not just our terms. So it's not a dictation of what we think's best, but actually a collaborative process where we're equal partners with the community, and you know, we have to speak the language that they understand. So we have to unpack the languages that we're using academically to meet the grassroots communities and people. So terminology is really important, and also the language, and be aware of cultural disability and other cultural aspects. We need to be considering these things. And awareness of invisible barriers, very important, I think. So these were some of the key things. I know I have run out of time, so these were some of the key things that were mentioned.
Thank you, that's brilliant. Thanks for that summary. So would Marcus, would you like to update a bit more on the Making Equal Research Partnerships
Yeah, so I've shared my screen. Our first question was what problems usually get in the way when we try to make equal research partnerships with communities, and how do we move past them? So we addressed the elephant in the room, which is that power and resources early on, it needs to be established in terms of what is an equal power, what's the equal research relationship, and what are the power dynamics, what are the resources that are going to be used, are they mutually beneficial in terms of the intentions, the resources that we'll use, and are we able to create a long-term plan that's clarified for both parties to understand, okay, yes, this is a stepping stone, but from each side we are going to where? Politics and history often tends to get in the way. Using co-production to level the field and hand power back to the community. Yep, I heard an interesting framework, which is called SALT, which is a strength-based approach, which can be used to kind of ignite the interest, to collect data from communities, and also making a space for what happens when we disagree, because of course, people are going to have different views. And if that happens, we don't just want to default to the people that have the power. So how can we agree on the outside how to resolve these differences of opinions and how to move on forward? So our next question was, how can we avoid using communities unfairly in research partnerships? Honesty, openness, payment. You're not presenting a blueprint. The community is involved in presenting at each stage, looking at intentions, transparency. A good point I heard was connecting all of the research work that's done so that we no longer have these different silos of activity that can sometimes plague the sector. And also an almost decolonization of how we understand research hierarchies to work, because if you do academic research, you're considered a genius, and participatory research is almost anecdotal. I think I'm quoting someone who's already said that prior to me. Anything else? Yeah, valuing participatory research more, power exits even more in health, and the power dynamics are even more deeply entrenched in the health sector. And we kind of got into a really, really deep discussion around that, but I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to keep it brief.
Thank you for that. That's great, thank you. So would you like, Caroline or Nalini, would you like to share a bit about what you discussed in your breakout, the letting communities decide what to research?
Yep, I'll share our screen as well. So what we had was what problems and solutions come up when communities lead research, and that was a really sort of interesting discussion. Something about the value of the research that is done by the community is, who is the expert, you know, where is the lived community, the lived experience. Somebody sort of said it would be really nice if communities could lead on research, but there's that need for training and skills to be added into the mix. And then another point is the exchange of skills that comes when communities lead research and how it gets valued. Our next question was, how can we balance power and interests when community goals will differ from researchers? And there were some really interesting examples of this. And we unpicked some of the examples and found that probably the key things that we need to include there are managing people's expectations and managing accountability and the ethics within the community. Managing the expectations was unpicked more about sometimes you can report back your findings, but it has to go through another process. So it's a long and drawn out thing, and there may be things that can't be changed, or a different solution has to be found, and so therefore people's expectations have to be heard. And then there's something about the voices can be heard, the political influence, and there was an example of where there had been a change of the political power and people felt much more inclined to take part in this type of thing because they believed that they would be heard more often. And so sometimes getting involved in the community research is nothing about the research, it's about the expectation and the perception that it's actually going to be used and listened to. So I think I'll stop there. Anybody else from our group want to add anything that I've missed or misrepresented?
You're all good. You're all good, Caroline. That was brilliant.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing that. So yes, I think Dom, it looks like you're the last one standing in your group. So I don't know if you wouldn't mind just briefly sharing back some of the main points you discussed in the using what communities know to make change.
Yeah, okay. And the two questions were, what are problems and solutions that come up when we translate community research into change, or when we try to translate it into change? And how can we share findings to help communities directly, which is a really interesting question, actually. And one of the first things was obviously building some infrastructure. So community research networks are really important, and building a network of people who've done this sort of thing can help us with the address some of the issues when we translate community research, or when we are trying to translate community research into change. There was a big issue came up about validation. It was a really interesting one about how sometimes what people say they want or they would desire, when you actually come to try and implement that, it turns out that perhaps it wasn't as popular as you'd thought. So an issue about validation and about, a combination of the community research and then surveying came up. I think that's something that Saffron was suggesting. The question that interested us a lot was about this thing about how we share findings to help communities directly and not just through academic papers. And so some of the things that have happened through websites, using spaces that people go to, such as shopping centres and high streets, little examples of making exhibitions, a travelling exhibition, which you could take into a shopping centre or high street, because it's so important that if we've got to derive this knowledge from communities, that the communities themselves have access to that knowledge. Often, it just goes off into academia or into a policy arena without the wider community knowing or understanding what's happened. And then the issue again of paying people to do this, so paying community members to actually be the messengers about the findings of community research, we also felt was an important principle. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Brilliant. Well, I think everyone's shared back. So just wanted to say huge thanks for coming along to this. Massive thanks to the speakers as well. In terms of next steps, so we are going to be sharing around a question and answer. We're going to be sharing the recording. We're also going to be sort of writing up some of these discussions into a report as well. So we want to make sure that, what the discussion we've had here and all this great learning that we've shared with each other, is useful to you and can inform your sort of practice going forward. And then just a quick one to say as well. So Alex is the community engagement manager for the Newham Community Research Network, and a bit short on time now, but we're going to be sharing her email. And if you know any other organisations working in Newham that you think would be interested in being part of the network, that could be community organisations, but it could also be academic institutes, anyone who's doing research. We're really keen to hear from them and try and bring them into the partnership. So yeah, just a big thank you. And we're also hoping to do an in-person event in September or October time, not sure exactly when. We were scuppered by the tube strikes today, which were then cancelled. But so yeah, we're hoping we can do something where everyone come together and sort of continue to network and to continue sort of share and exchange, everything that we're doing and learning. So yes, another big thank you, and hope you have brilliant evenings and not long to the weekend. So thanks very much for all your time today.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.